Good afternoon, everyone. I am Christine O'Neill, Chairman of Brodie's, and I'm very glad to welcome you to the next in our series of Enlightened Thinking webinars, and to what we hope will be the first of several discussions over the next few months, looking at what we might expect from this year's US presidential election and its implications for the United States, for the UK, and globally. So I want to begin just by introducing our three panellists who've kindly agreed to contribute to this webinar. First, and chairing this afternoon's session, is Karen Betts. Karen has been Chief Executive of the Scotch Whisky Association since 2017, which, as many of you will know, represents one of the UK's most significant export sectors. Importantly, in a previous life, Karen was a practicing lawyer. But even more importantly for this afternoon's purposes, she enjoyed a 16-year career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, holding a variety of posts in London and overseas, including as British Ambassador in Morocco. Karen was also a councillor in the British Embassy in Washington and held roles at the UK's permanent representation in the EU in Brussels and the British Embassy in Baghdad. And in London, she served in the Cabinet Office and the Joint Intelligence Committee, as well as in a variety of other roles. If we'd another hour for this seminar, I would ask Karen to talk to us about the innovation that's been happening in the whisky industry in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and her expectations for economic recovery. But we'll have to leave that one for another time. Our second panellist is Stephen Skinner. Stephen is a trial attorney practicing in West Virginia. So again, important, he's a lawyer. But again, more importantly for this afternoon's seminar is Stephen's direct experience of US politics. Stephen served in various capacities in the West Virginia Democratic Party prior to his election to the West Virginia House of Delegates in 2012, where he was the state's first openly gay member of that legislature. During his 2 terms, Stephen received accolades for his work in civil rights and civil justice, and since leaving office, he continues to serve in public advocacy and independent expenditure organisations at the state level. He also serves on the Victory Campaign Board of the LGBTQ Victory Fund, an organisation dedicated to electing openly LGBTQ people to office. If we'd another hour for this seminar, I'd ask Stephen to talk about the work he's doing as part of the national prescription opiate litigation, which involves claims by state and local governments against pharmaceutical manufacturers, distributors and pharmacies in relation to the harm caused by opiate dependence and abuse. And I would also ask him how it could be that it took until this month the US Supreme Court to find that the Civil Rights Act prohibited workplace discrimination based on sexual orientation or transgender status. But that's something we'll also have to leave for the next time. Our third panellist is Mike Moffo. Mike is the founder of Moffo Co., a creative strategy consultancy that provides bespoke communications for campaigns, causes and brands. Mike's based in Edinburgh and in Washington, DC, and specialises in bringing together grassroots research and media strategy to build and manage campaigns. Between 2002 and 2008, Mike worked on 21 political campaigns in 18 different states as a democratic political organiser, strategist and manager. He worked on the 2004 presidential campaign of former Secretary of State John Kerry and on the 2008 and 2012 campaigns of President Barack Obama. He's provided communications and management strategy to Airbnb, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the US Department of Education, as well as to the Obama White House. And he also worked as a senior consultant to Elizabeth Warren during the 2018 midterm elections. Having moved to Edinburgh in 2013, Mike has worked with European political campaigns and creative agencies while also continuing his US work. For example, California Attorney General Kamala Harris and former US Representative Gabby Giffords' Americans for Responsible Solutions campaign concerned with gun control. If we'd another hour to talk to Mike, I'd be asking him how a person gets to be based in Edinburgh and Washington, DC, because we have a few candidates for that, and about his favourite characters from the West Wing and whether any of those 7 series were in fact accurate. But we don't have time for that either. So I will do no more than to hand over to Karen, who's going to chair the rest of this afternoon's session.
Well, thanks very much, Christine, for your kind introductions and for asking me to do this today. You've certainly given me the excuse amid the human and economic misery of COVID-19 to have a long, hard think about what's going on in the US right now, what might happen in the election and how that might impact us as non-Americans. In short, you've made me look up and out, which is never time wasted. I'm delighted to be here alongside Stephen and Mike. In Stephen and Mike, I think we have real insiders and experts, a politician from West Virginia and a veteran of 22 US political campaigns, including Barack Obama's. So I'm fascinated to hear what Mike and Stephen will have to say, and fascinated to hear whether they will give us any predictions. But first of all, a few thoughts from me as an outside observer in all of this, about what's going on and why that matters, about some of the issues in the race, and then finally about some of the things perhaps to watch out for as the election campaigns unfold. First, what's going on and why it matters. The first thing I would say is a really obvious point, I think, which is that US elections really matter. Not just to America and its citizens, but really to everyone, everywhere. Of course, you all know this, which is why you're here today. But American election campaigns inform America and its actions. And America's actions are genuinely, truly consequential for countries all around the world. And I think that's unusual. It's hard to think of another country that that's true of. The economic and defence heft of the United States also has a significant bearing on the global economy and on global security, on which global economic health is based. Under President Trump, the US has changed direction, I think, in the way it deals with the rest of the world, albeit perhaps not quite as radically as we might think. I think to a degree the seeds of that change in direction have been sown in previous administrations. But I think, as foreigners, we'll probably have less confidence now that America will be the stabilizing force in global affairs that we've come to rely on over the years. President Trump's approach has been much more transactional and much more populist in dealing beyond America's shores than we've seen previously. While some of this is about President Trump himself, it also, I think, reflects genuine bipartisan questions about America's relationships with other countries. China has been a preoccupation, as has the World Trade Organization, and these issues are not going to go away, even if Trump doesn't win re-election in November. In the interest of time, I won't go on more about the global impact of the election, but suffice to say, I can't remember whoever said this, I think it was said about France first actually, but when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. So we do need to understand what's happening in the US and in the US election, why those things are happening and how that might impact on us and our businesses. On the race itself, I would highlight three things. First, I think it's too close to call. Stephen and Mike might disagree with that. In the national polls, I think that Biden is currently leading by about 9 points. He's led Trump by a number of points for a number of months now, and his lead does seem to be increasing. But the big caveat to that is that national polls can be misleading in US elections. I think, as we all know from 2016, you can win the popular vote, but you can fail to win the presidency. However, I think that the polling data does suggest that Trump does have a fight on his hands. I think it's possible, quite possible, that he can overcome the Biden lead, but he is going to have his work cut out. Secondly, on the race itself, on the issues, there are obviously some very clear issues emerging. One very evidently is the economy. So before COVID-19 hit, I think President Trump had been quite confident about his economic performance. The US economy had been growing and creating more jobs. But COVID-19 has dealt a severe economic blow. Just in March and April, the US economy lost more than 20 million jobs. There have been substantial declines in consumer spending and in GDP. It's not clear what sort of a recovery it will be. And both candidates are going to have to articulate a clear way out of this massive burden that the crisis is placing on the US economy. And it's not clear what the direction that they're going to articulate will be. In my mind, there is a question about how coherent Trump will be, and then equally about how progressive Biden will be, and perhaps how close he will go to some of the economic policies outlined by Bernie Sanders and by Elizabeth Warren in their primary campaigns. And you know, again, for Europeans looking at this, American governments tend to be less economically interventionist than European ones. So, you know, we measure it against that measure. Added to that overall economic impact, I think one of the very interesting economic things to watch in this is the spotlight has been shone, I think, in COVID much more on state level policies and the patchwork of state level policies across the US, both on health and also on mitigating the impact of COVID-19. COVID is shining a light on the differences between states and state laws and the quite different responses being pursued across different states. And so that has a bearing, that will have a bearing on America's economic and health response to COVID. On the one hand, I think that gives perhaps the president in particular an opportunity to find people to blame if things don't go economically in a positive or a consistently positive direction. On the other hand, I think for both candidates, it takes quite a lot of the control of the recovery away from the president and away from the federal government, and that will present challenges, I think, as the campaigns roll forward. The third thing I'm going to highlight on the race itself is Black Lives Matter and the killing of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis, which, you know, as you will all know, has ignited waves of protests across the US that go really right to the heart, I think, of the place of the African American community in American society, goes to the heart of America's values, and I think, you know, Americans' own beliefs about themselves. I think for the candidates, the movement poses some pretty fundamental questions should they choose to answer them. And I think how they answer them is going to influence the campaign, and certainly in Biden's case, I think it will influence the team he places clearly visibly around him, including his pick for vice president. Finally, the third thing I would highlight on the race itself is trade and America's relationships with its trading partners. And I say trade partly because it's a significant part of what I do now. I think for the US, it is about the US government, for the US economic operators now and economic leaders, particularly Robert Lighthizer and Steve Mnuchin, it is about trade and about how trade impacts the performance of the American economy and indeed the inclusiveness of America's economy. I think for us outside the US, it's not just about trade, it's about how the US deals with the rest of the world. And this goes back a bit to what I said at the beginning. You know, how is the US going to deal with its trading partners and its trading adversaries? What about the big question around China, which is obviously key to the US-China relationship, but does impact everybody else as well? And then sort of fundamentally in that global space, what about those global institutions that the US once helped to establish? The United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organizations, all of those organizations set up mostly after the Second World War are, you know, need reform, need attention. And right now it looks as though the Americans, or at least President Trump, is losing interest in them, and that is pretty troubling. So those are my sort of issues to watch on the race. On the campaign, the things I would highlight, again as an outsider, to watch. I mean, the first point, obviously, is the importance of swing states in presidential elections. So a swing state is any state that could be won by either side, and there are about 10 of them. So in the last 20 years, 40 of America's 50 states have voted for the same party. So the swing states amount to about 10, and they are key for either presidential candidate getting enough electoral college votes to win the election. In 2020, but I'll be really interested to hear what Mike and Stephen have to say, they seem to be shaping up to be Arizona, Michigan, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Florida. So what happens in those states becomes really critical, and those will be the battleground states. In those battleground states, candidates have to mobilise their voter base. When I was in Morocco, I was good friends with the US ambassador there at the time, who was equally good friends with Valerie Jarrett, who was President Obama's chief of staff for a number of years. And I remember her saying at a dinner party one evening when she was in Morocco, that, you know, she said, and this was just before, I think, the 2016 presidential election, she said, you can have all the support that you like, but you've got to get your vote out. You've got to motivate and mobilise your supporters to actually go along and vote. Now, generally how, well, there are all sorts of ways in which presidential campaigns do that, and I'm not going to presume to be the expert there. But I think that does raise particular issues about campaigning this time round. I mean, how normal is campaigning going to be this year? Traditionally, US presidential elections have run on big campaign rallies, and the ability for candidates to get out there and press the flesh. Big question now about how impacted this is going to be by COVID-19 this summer. President Trump held his first rally, I think, in 3 months in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the weekend. So that looks in some ways like a bit of a return to normality. But I think, you know, that the attendance at the rally was significantly below what President Trump would have hoped for. That the stadium was, I think, only about a third full. So query whether normal campaigning is going to return. I mean, obviously we don't know whether people didn't turn up because they don't support Trump or because they were worried about catching COVID-19 when they were in the stadium. But I think that does pose some interesting questions around rallies and how the campaigning is going to be conducted. I mean, so far, Biden seems to be offering quite a stark alternative to that, in that he is being much more cautious, and where he has done public gatherings recently, it looks as though he intends to follow the public health guidance and respect the science. So they have been much smaller and more televised events. But so query, what will happen to traditional campaigning, and will a different version of campaigning work? Can it work in getting people, as I say, sufficiently motivated and mobilised actually to go out and vote for you? The other question in that sort of set of issues is about postal voting and vote by mail, as it's called in America. And to Europeans, I think this is a surprisingly political issue in the US. Of course, it's particularly significant now because I think there's a stream of thought that says if more people could be registered as voters by post, that might help get voters to turn out in November's election, if there is a concern at that point that crowded polling stations might be a risk to health. But equally, there's quite a division between the Republicans and Democrats about whether vote by post is a good thing. The Republicans, and Trump has said quite a lot about this recently, seem to think that it will disadvantage them. Whether or not people are able to do it depends on state legislation, and whether it's possible for states to get legislation through in time that doesn't end up mired in months of legal challenge will be interesting to see. And my final point on watching the campaign unfold is about governors. It seems to me that American state governors matter quite a lot more now, very visibly in this race, than perhaps they have in the past. And that's because, as I said before, they have so much control at the moment over how their state and localities within their state respond to the health and the economic challenges of COVID-19. And, you know, it seems to me that this time round, actually governors could materially influence people's votes in perhaps a way that they haven't necessarily done before. And one of the really interesting things about that, I think, is, you know, I hope that it will prove a very fertile sort of auditioning ground for presidential candidates in 2024. You know, governors are being given a real opportunity at the moment to shine or not to shine. And I think that those that do shine and that do lead very credible, decisive, thorough state responses to COVID-19, you know, may find that has been that produces real opportunities for the future. I'm going to stop here and hand over to the real experts, but just with one final caveat, which is that polling has been so unreliable in recent elections in the United States and indeed in the UK in our elections, and also in the Brexit referendum. So, you know, we sit here and we study polls and we try and work out what is going to happen. And in some instances, we have been completely trounced and taken by surprise when the results have come out in quite a different place to where the polls would have put them. And that does make me wonder about the sort of the silent voters, the people who are very clearly for one side or the other, but don't necessarily say so, and may even actually dishonestly answer questions from pollsters. So that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to finish talking before my dog takes over and put myself onto mute. And I'm going to hand over to Stephen for his thoughts. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. You raised a lot of great points. I want to start today by talking about living in a red state. West Virginia is kind of battles to be the Trumpiest state in the union. And it's actually the majority of voter registrations in West Virginia is Democrat. And we've been seeing a conversion basically over the last 30 years where people are registered to vote. And just so you understand, not every state do you register with a political party. Some states you do. It's very useful for those of us who follow to know how somebody's registered. And we measure the difference between how people are registered and then how they vote and behave. We do that in polling. And West Virginia has one of the largest percentages of folks who are registered as Democrats who will self-identify as Republicans. That's a conversion. West Virginia is also extremely white and very working class and has one of the oldest populations in the country. It is not unusual to drive around West Virginia and see Trump flags up, meaning it's the logo, it's flying up with an American flag. I think the question, let's go back 4 years, why did folks vote for Trump? And there's sort of a political scientist way to look at it. And then there's what's happening on the ground. I think, as I'm sure you have discussed, it's not unrelated to the Brexit vote. You know, why did the UK vote for Brexit? Who are those people? I think that in the US, when you have from 2008 to 2016, an enormous amount of economic upheaval and the recovery of the American economy and the expansion of healthcare across the country, you still have a large percentage of people who were not better off in 2016 than they were in 2008. And there was a feeling that they weren't being heard. And that was, by and large, a lot of white working class folks and seniors who didn't seem to have any of the benefits of the Obama presidency, despite the Affordable Care Act. So I think it's really important. I've been out there. I had to try to get people in 2016. I was on the ballot to run for a higher office. I had to thread a needle, try to get people who were going to vote for Trump to vote for me. And I think that it can be very easy to dismiss those folks. Let me jump in to life today versus life 6 months ago. 6 months ago, there had not been a Democratic primary. We did not know who the nominee was going to be. And we almost don't seem to acknowledge that anymore. The pre-COVID, we were still having problems. The Democratic Party was having problems in figuring out how we wanted to go into this election. And for a lot of folks like me as a Democrat, I was fairly unhappy. Post-COVID is a complete reset. And I think if you look at the polling, there was an enormous opportunity for President Trump to take the lockdown, the leadership, and make a lot with that. When you look back at other American crises or international crises, like 9/11, and you see what happens after the event, and the American people rallying around a leader. Trump actually had a little bump in the polls, and he squandered it. And I think maybe we'll have a little more discussion on that. But it's this idea that he hasn't been able to help himself. And so this is kind of gone right into, it's played right into Biden's hands with the ability to be measured. I think the second thing, and I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in rural America. The death of George Floyd is it is really unlike anything that I have seen on the ground in the U.S. And the activation of people you would not expect to have been compelled. It's almost as if America is reckoning with itself and with its history right now. It is not seeing the future as much as it is recognizing the past. Even in the small town that is closest to where I am right now, we had a Black Lives Matter rally occur, and there were about 500 people who attended, majority white, and everybody wearing a mask and very respectful. And I have never seen anything like it. We just have not seen that type of activism on the ground, and that's happening. And you'll see you will see some articles out there about what's happening in rural America, and this is not just happening in the cities. So this, of course, goes back to the president being unable to help himself. He can't stop playing just to his base. And in the end, you need your base to show up, and you've got to get them to vote. I mean, one tends to sort of think about the higher ideas and the choices being made for the presidency, but the reality is this is a highly organized technological drive to identify your voters and get them to the polls in the states that matter. And the alienation, I think, that is the president seems to encourage to not go beyond his base is going to be a problem, because he's going to need more than just those folks to show up. So what happens when you combine COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement, the George Floyd movement? There are, we don't know. And I keep waiting for a George Floyd backlash, and certainly you can see it. It's very easy to identify what's going on, but I wonder whether it's not simply all of that activity is happening within Trump's base, and that the independents are being more thoughtful about it. And I think there's a lot to be said for at least a good portion of the independents and some of the Republicans, that there's a fatigue of the drama. You know, President Obama loved the no drama Obama motto. And many people look back to those days and think, gosh, wouldn't it be nice to be calm, where controversies were nothing compared to what we have on a daily basis. And I think that maybe all of this happens at the same time and creates a fairly toxic formula for Donald Trump's reelection chances. But no one should think that he doesn't have the ability to be reelected. I do want to tell you what I obsessively look at every single day, which is Project 538, which is the site run by Nate Silver, who's a pretty amazing pollster. And one of the things that
I think we've lost Stephen for a minute. In which case, I might turn over to Mike Moffo. On that note, Stephen having been cut a bit short, Mike, shall we hand over to you to tell us what you think?
Sure. Thanks, Karen. And just let me know, folks, if Stephen's able to get back in and you want me to hit the pause button again and throw it back over to him. I'm happy to do that. And I share on that last point Stephen was making. I share his admiration for Nate Silver. I've had several opportunities to work with him over the years, dating back to 2007, 2008, when he first got into political polling and synthesis. And in fact, some of the information that I'm going to lead off with is partially attributable to him, as well as former colleagues of his, Nate Cohn, who's at the Upshot, New York Times Upshot, which is also a polling aggregator, and Harry Enton at CNN. I would say that the combination of those three and the operations, the polling operations that are around them, would be the three strongest recommendations for folks who want to follow along. But I'm going to be as ambitious as I can with my 10 minutes, knowing that it's impossible to touch on all of the key components and considerations of this election. So there's three things that I'm going to try to at least skim quickly through. One, a snapshot of the race, again, borrowing from some of that the latest polling information. Number two, to run through very, very briefly, hardly giving it the attention that it deserves, is campaign playbooks for both the Trump and Biden campaigns. So you might read this as expected strategy and tactics for both campaigns. And then finally, just COVID-19, as you know, as Karen and Stephen both pointed out, this race is going to be unlike anything before it. So my experience is, not very valuable when it comes to how are we going to change, because all of this is unfolding in real time. But I will try to, at least highlight a couple very important things that I'm convinced are going to be determining factors, and even more so because of the impacts of the lockdown and COVID and social distancing. So I'll be skimming the surface, and everyone is most welcome to use questions to indicate areas where I should go deeper. So first off, state of the race. Former Vice President Biden is well ahead in the national polls now. More importantly, he holds the advantage in the pivotal swing states, enough pivotal swing states to win and more. The chances are, we can get this out of the way. I don't know if you'd call this a prediction, or I would think most accurately, this is what I think is most likely to happen, because that's what a good synthesis of many polls, if you're looking at one through a keyhole, right, then you do have margin for error. The more you look at and the more you synthesize them, the more useful they are. And the chances are that come November, Joe Biden will win comfortably, not a blowout win, and not paper thin. That's where we stand right now. It's worth emphasizing that there's more than 4 months to go, obviously, and even within the current margin of error, there's a range of results. What I mean by range is where we could go from this kind of comfortable win, if it could go in the more positive direction for Biden. For instance, for him to score a huge win in November, very little actually needs to change. Right now, I think Karen said 9. The latest stuff that I'm looking at says a 10-point advantage. But again, whether it's 9 or 10, 9 is the largest presidential win in the U.S. in 56 years. That was Bill Clinton in 1996. That was a 9-point win. That's a blowout by modern American standards, and for Biden to be leading by 10 points now is definitely saying something. More impressively, he's not that far from shifting a few states with the most recent polling that we've seen and getting somewhere north, of a very high number of electoral votes. Some say maybe 390 or even 400. For those not familiar with the Electoral College, 270 is what's required to win. But let's assume, and the polling does indicate, that Biden would win all of the electoral votes that Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. That was 232. And one or more polls, recent polls, is showing Biden also leading in Arizona, in Florida, in Georgia, in Michigan, in North Carolina, in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And if you put those all together, you're just south of 370 electoral votes. And then you even have him within 1 point in states that never would have been considered competitive, Iowa and Texas. Am I predicting that he's going to sweep all the states that he's currently leading in a poll? No, I'm not predicting it one way or another, but that just goes to show how close that it could be from a monumental size of victory. It could also go the other way, and it could, and this is not to say that polls don't mean anything. It goes to show that small changes when you're dealing with populations and an electoral college, certainly, can create swings. That's why you have to, point it somewhere in the middle. What might happen between now and then, and to kind of sway it one way or another? Obviously, the only poll that matters is the one that's on election day. The news cycles are moving faster than ever. It's impossible to, COVID is a story that can take on many forms, but it's clear, and particularly in the US, that the actual health impacts, the public health impacts, are not going to go away in the next 4 months. And so it's a story that can't possibly go away. I don't think it's likely that the Black Lives Matter protests are going to, quote unquote, go away. They've been with us since the founding of the country, but what form they take, and what happens if something unexpected, another form of crisis, another thing that might dominate the headlines that we're not able to predict right now, would have the impact on both. I know that none of us is feeling that it could possibly get more chaotic and unpredictable than it is right now, but history teaches us that is as likely as not. A couple other things. It's important to note that a comeback, right, or let's just say a drastic change in the electorate and in the polling from this point in the race to the election did not happen in 2016. Certainly no one on this call has, or on this webinar has claimed that, but you may run into that, with folks who might say, well, Trump came back before, he can do it again. Well, that is actually, in fact, not the case. There was at no point in 2016 that Hillary Clinton had polling leads close to what Joe Biden currently enjoys. But history does provide other examples of shakeups in a race. But you do, in order to get to, you have to go back as far as 1948. Harry Truman was facing a similar deficit in the national polls as Trump is facing now, and he went on to win by 5 points nationally, but he just barely won. And in fact, that's the race that produced the famous photos of the incorrect newspaper headline, Dewey defeats Truman. More recently, Bill Clinton was in a distant third place at this point in 1992, and he went back to win the popular vote by 6 points. That was a very unique race where it was a three-way race with independent Ross Perot as well as George H.W. Bush. But it has happened, and the nature of the battleground states, the nature of political polarization, which I would love to get into in more detail, and the nature of the news media and how media is consumed are the dominant realities of presidential politics that will allow this sort of volatile change happen in the 2020 race in a way that it couldn't have happened, as recently as 8 years ago. So very quickly on playbooks, just moving forward on Trump first. Some of this you'll be well aware of, and others maybe less so. So we could take comments and questions to separate one from the other. So I'll quickly go through. Number one is the blame game. The Trump playbook is, you can already see it there. The Teflon Don has a pathological inability to accept responsibility. This is what's finally catching up to him with COVID-19. But his response will be to take it just to another level, what we've already seen, China, blaming Democrats, government bureaucracy, blaming the media, blaming state governors, outsiders. And this tact can also be used proactively. For instance, attacking the integrity and independence of the legal system now, so that when the pressure is on them to make decisions about voting laws and voting rights and which votes to count in a very contested tight election, there will already be those questions in the water at where Trump's base will understand. You've even seen proactive blame game on the U.S. Postal Service from the Trump administration and spokespeople in advance of their opposition to postal voting. Number two is just these declarations of victory, grandstanding in ways that ignore the facts and logic. It's mystifying to some, I'll grant that, especially those who have a more balanced media diet internationally, but it's a very different situation, those declarations of victory, if you live in a different news echo chamber. The third is digital arsenal. Team Trump will has doubled down on what put him in the White House, which is their ability to bypass the media filter, disparaging the mainstream media in the process, and then target and narrowcast their own digital content. Number four is keeping it simple. The average American general election voter for president only has a low appetite for nuance and detail that advantages Trump, who has really no consistent ideology to speak of. Number 5 is Mitch MCConnell. I think internationally, perhaps this is appreciated more than I notice, but Mitch MCConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, is the most powerful force normalizing and enabling Trump ever. Things as consequential as Supreme Court justices, which is one of the major motivating factors of a lot of Trump's base that refuses to leave him, and other court appointments, and also saving him from impeachment by having Republican control of the Senate. And then finally, number 6, destroy Joe Biden, preparing for a torrential downpour of insults and accusations. I mean, you don't need to prepare for it since it's already here, really. The one key differentiation, I think, which is clear between Joe Biden and Trump's previous opponent of Hillary Clinton, is the unpopularity. Joe Biden just doesn't have that unpopularity, that dislike that from wider swaths of voters that Hillary Clinton did have, for a variety of different reasons. And only now Trump is realizing that and is going to try to change that. So moving on quickly on Biden playbook, and I'm not tracking my time as I probably should be, so please feel free, Karen, to jump in and pull me from the stage here. But I'll just jump into Biden's. One is Democratic unity. Many feared the primary would be divisive and damaging for good reason. There were so many candidates, a record number. But in some ways, I think unpredictably, for most, Biden prevailed quickly. And he's had more time to focus on bringing his opponent's supporters on board. I think mixed results so far, but some really good moves, and he's benefited from the additional time that he's had. As Stephen pointed out, and this did happen right before the lockdown, where he sealed up the nomination. But that time, while he hasn't been able to campaign actively, has been well spent behind the scenes, getting or working toward that Democratic unity. 2 is surrogates. This is part of that too. They need the team needs more voices delivering more content on more media channels. The virus and Black Lives Matter protests and Trump himself, of course, they will dominate the airwaves for good reason, and Team Biden really needs to innovate to stay ahead of this and remain relevant and remain in people's eyeballs and earbuds. Number 3 is the key battleground demographics. A key component of Biden's electability argument, you may recall in the primary, was his ability to connect, quote, air quotes, to connect with certain voter groups that Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. And so focusing on that will be key. And so let me just close up with these last ones. The vice presidential pick, I anticipate getting a question on that. We know why that's particularly important. Play catch up on digital. The Biden team was way behind when they won the nomination in kind of March, April, the Trump campaign, and they've started to come back, but they need a lot more. And then finally, don't give an inch. This sounds like a motivational speech, but I assure you, at least from my perspective, this is a strategic point. Playing whack-a-mole with falsehoods and Trumpian misinformation is daunting, but they really have no choice. The current polling situation shows that no matter how voters are ideologically inclined, or maybe in a polarized world they have a certain loyalty, the impact on their life and on their safety from leadership is really showing through. So I will close there. I'm sure some Q&A will touch on some of the coronavirus impacts and some of the vote by mail stuff. So why don't I leave it there and we'll jump into Q&A.
Brilliant, thanks Mike. That's really great, fascinating set of issues. Stephen, we lost you just as you were about to talk about Nate Silver. Would you like a couple of minutes to finish off? And then I think we do need to move to Q&A, otherwise we're going to run out of time.
I was right at 10 minutes, so I'm happy to go on.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks very much, both of you. Really interesting. If anybody has got questions, please do ask them on the Q&A panel. We've had a few already, and they have sort of centered around Trump on the one hand and Biden on the other. So I'm going to pose the Biden questions. Some questions about, and I'm going to pose those that I think haven't been covered in the presentation so far. So some questions about his health. And I think, you know, there have been questions out there in the national press about, you know, does he have the health and I suppose the resilience to see through the campaign as energetically as he should, and then to lead the US as president. And also about whether he has the right people around him. Is he making, you know, has he got a big brains trust, and is he making the decisions that he needs to make to get, as you say, Mike, all the people out there on all the different channels, making sure that the Democrat message is very vocally there and very understood. Mike, Stephen, who would like to pitch in for that one?
Well, I'll just, another question I think just popped up about how important is the vice presidential running mate going to be. I believe it's going to be critically important because that helps address any health issues. I don't know whether there are any legitimate questions about Vice President Biden's health. Certainly that is a theme from the Trump campaign, and they love that, and they're working hard on it. And I see the Biden campaign pushing back on it by basically pointing out, ridiculing Trump. But that's a different topic. I think the vice presidential candidate is critical right now, and you know they're going to time it. They don't want to overplay their hands. What do you think, Mike?
Well, look, on health, I think it's overplayed in both directions, to be honest, right? I mean, I know a number of 77-year-olds, and are they the same as when they were 55? No, they're not. That doesn't mean that, you know, we're talking about diminished capacity, you know, kind of dementia, right? Or diminished capacity, or, you know, the inability to do the job. It just means that that is an older man, older than yesterday, older than last year. And when you've spent your entire career, literally since age 25, when he was elected first to the United States Senate, you spent your entire career in the public eye. There's evidence everywhere you turn that your 77-year-old self is different than your 25-year-old self. So there's going to be diminishing capacity. That doesn't mean that he's not capable of doing the job. And I think it is self-evident to anyone who cares that, you know, the comparison with Trump is laughable at any age or any mental capacity. I don't think that's a partisan issue. I mean, I think that's, you know, there's plenty of Republicans who will say that a lot more vociferously than me. On the brain trust, I mean, here's what I would just quickly say. I think anyone, and you know, my colleagues, my former boss, Clough and Axelrod and Gibbs, who I know and respect an incredible amount, they would be the first to tell you that if you win, you're a genius, and if you lose, you're the worst political operative, and they won. But what I will also importantly say is that, well, they were a brilliant team, but the size of the brain trust is more often than not a downside. Infamously, the Clinton campaigns have always had very wide, very diverse, because they've had so much experience, and that causes more trouble than it's worth. The defining characteristic of the Obama brain trust was he was new to politics. He had a small team. They were very good, but it was a closed door, and it wasn't all this kind of variety of opinion and kind of different motivations within the camp. Biden's team, I think, is somewhere in the middle, quite frankly, because he has had a very long career. He does benefit from all the good counsel of all three of those individuals there. that were mentioned in that question, but it is broader than the Obama team was in 2008.
And I mean, who do you think the best pick is for vice president?
Well, I mean, I worked for Elizabeth Warren, and I thought for the same reasons I thought she would make the best president, I think she would make the best vice president. I don't believe the arguments about that, quite frankly, the arguments that you mostly hear, right, about VP. There's just no evidence to back up what pundits say. You know, if they're from a certain state, they'll help you win that state. That's not true. That almost never happens. Or their characteristics make up for the weaknesses. I mean, there's no denying that on age, it's important. The VP is important when you have a very old presidential candidate. That doesn't mean that they have to be as young as possible in order to balance out the age of Joe Biden. So I don't think it's that. I mean, you've had very successful pairings like Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who were very much notably the same demographic, the same generation. They were both from the South. They were both kind of experienced, you know, kind of for that age. So it's not, the things that you hear to justify VP picks, I think, are mostly speculative. I think that he should just pick who would make the best president, and that's my opinion. But that opinion obviously will vary from person to person, and I probably disagree with Joe Biden on that point too.
So Stephen, give us a varied view then. What would your inclination be?
Well, I think Mike's right. I do want to adjust. There's a question here. Joe Biden has promised that it will be a woman, period. So we do know that. Where we are in the U.S. today would be incredibly symbolic for him and important to have the running mate be a woman of color. And obviously Kamala Harris would be in the lead for the pick. Now, you know, this is the math on this is pretty difficult. And I don't know how they do it and when they do it, but it's going to happen very soon. I think it would be pretty powerful, because if we don't have in many states African Americans turn out and vote at 2008 levels, we run some big risks. Notably in Pennsylvania, that would have made the difference in 2016 if the African American vote had been at the level at 2008. So the question is, can a woman of color help get out the vote?
I'm going to wrap up, I think, by a final question, but then I think we do have to finish running out of time. Steve and Mike, you've seen the questions as well. Were there any final questions out?
I'm just scaling through. I mean, one just final point, because I didn't get a chance. When there are a number of questions here talking about turning out, right? And it's been addressed in number of questions and answers. Turnout is going to be singularly, especially in coronavirus era, the coronavirus election is going to be a function of voting laws, which, as you mentioned, Karen, are governed by the state, but there has been a uniform orthodoxy in both parties that are oppositional to one another. Republicans, for a generation or more, they believe that having more voters, more people turn out, is bad for them, particularly voters of color, particularly voters of other kinds of minority groups. Democrats believe in the principle of more voters, and I think they also acknowledge that more voters of color and disenfranchised populations will help them based upon those issues. This is going to be the definitive fight of this election, even more so than persuading voters one way or another, is what is going to be declared legal, what will be the requirements of voting by mail, of voting in person. and how many polling locations in certain areas. And there's case studies for those who want to look into this of the Wisconsin primary and more recently the Georgia primary, where havoc is caused by Republican-dominated legislatures and governors restricting the amount of resources and restricting the amount of opportunities to vote. This will be why we will not know for days after the election what the final vote tally is, and there will be a lot, even if it wasn't close, we will have a period of days, if not longer, where we don't know what the result is because so many votes were cast by mail, and that takes a long time for them to be counted. And this, in these areas of uncertainty, is where trouble can brew.
Brilliant, thanks. And
let me just add one thing to that. I just had one friend win on primary day and lose a week later a statewide primary race. I had another friend lose a primary in Pennsylvania and win a week later. I cannot emphasize the vote by mail and how important that's going to be.
so for a final one-sentence answer, Mike, Stephen, which will be better for the UK, a Trump win or a Joe Biden win?
One sentence, Joe Biden.
I can't be someone other than myself. So there's, Joe Biden winning would be good for the UK. And
Great.
good for whiskey.
We need those tariffs removed. That's what we need from the US. Whoever wins presidential office. Thanks so much to Mike and Stephen. Can I hand back to Christine, who I think will wrap up our session?
I'm here, Karen. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all of our panelists this afternoon. I thought that was for a diplomat, that was an excellent political point you made just right at the end, Karen, just getting it in before we finished. To the panelists, our panelists have given up their time this afternoon for us and for the people who are participating in the seminar. Thank you so much to all three of you for your insights. We know that we have only started to scratch the surface, so you will be hearing from us again, but thank you meantime for what you've done this afternoon. Thanks to everyone who joined the webinar. We sat at more than 200 participants for the whole hour, which is a pretty remarkable endorsement of interest in the topic and in our panelists. So thank you very much for now, and we will close the webinar and we'll be back in touch with you soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.